Hi, welcome to another episode of our Eat and Drink Real Estate Podcast. My name is Scott Burgess. I'm with Citywide Title. Today, I have attorney Kevin Camden. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
Why don't you tell us a little bit just kind of how long you've been doing this, how you got started, and kind of where your office functions?
We office in Downers Grove, although the reality is I tend to office more out of my car. But we have office space in Downers Grove. I'm getting embarrassed by this number, licensed this fall for 97, so 27 years.
Yeah, good.
Principally involved in real estate since about 15. I'd done some other things. I had the privilege, and I still do to a degree, of representing law enforcement in collective bargaining and disciplinary hearings. But the bulk of our practice is residential real estate, commercial real estate, landlord-tenant leasing, and we do a fair amount of probate and estate planning as well.
Okay. Now, you and I were just talking prior to this a little bit ago. There's some kind of hot buttons in the market right now as far as what's going on with real estate. I know one thing you were bringing up is as is. So
yeah,
is that something you can kind of
a
expound
couple of things
on?
we're hearing a lot about in the marketplace. One is the NAR settlement, and we'll get back to my thoughts on why I don't think it's going to be much of a change by the time it all shakes out. But also, we've had more than a few deals lately come in as is contracts, and there's a very specific language in paragraph 36 of the 7.0, because that's typically what we see the standard form contract come in as. And we're getting more and more deals where there are what I would refer to as inappropriate requests being made for things that the purpose of as is to make sure that if you're buying a house and you do an inspection, which you are allowed under the as is, I want to be clear, as is not an inspection waiver, but it really limits what you should be asking for. And my advice to my clients and the agents that I work with is it's health and safety. The example I always use is if your inspector goes into the kitchen and looks up and sees the skylight at noon, or sees the sun at noon because there's a hole in the roof, that's the kind of stuff that I think you can be legitimately raising. Radon, of course, would fall into that as well. Sure. If we've got major plumbing, broken sewer lines, for example.
Okay.
What I'm seeing it used as probably for the last 6 months or so is kind of a tip in to get, for the buyers to edge other folks out. And then they send over a 3-page inspection report anyway. And it's frustrating for me because I don't think, it reminds me of, Indigo Montoya, you use that word, but I don't think you know what it means. People are saying, sure, we'll agree to as is, and then they just blow right through the language. And it's a nuisance to deal with, but that's life, right? It's what we're paid to do. Where it's a cautionary tale, in my opinion, is, and I always use Downers Grove, both because my office is there, but Downers Grove, even in a bad market, and do not understand me to say that this is a bad market by any means. Downers Grove, Naperville, they're always moving, right? They're hot.
Yep.
You get that deal on Sunday night, and you send me this inspection, or you send me your attorney review letter on Wednesday on an as-is deal and make all of these requests, there's a high probability that I'm advising my client and my agents, kill this deal and move on to the next one because they don't understand what as-is means. It's personally frustrating for me because often I'm the person dealing with the seller, and they're frustrated and they're raising their voice and they're angry with me, and I have to say, look, I understand, and you really have two options: deal with it, right, which nobody really likes to be told that, or walk. Now, I've had mixed results, probably 60-40, 60 with folks saying we might do something, 40% of the folks saying, no, we do understand what as-is means. We priced it accordingly.
Yeah.
We told you on the front end it might need X, it might need Y, kill the deal. In fact, I had one client do it, killed 3 contracts because of requests made as-is, and we finally sold on the 4th. And I also think that buyers are being told just initial line 36 in the contract, go ahead, get your inspection, ask for whatever you want, and I don't think they understand the gravity. I'll explain to my buyer clients, no, we're not going to ask for a broken switch plate or an outlet or a ground fault to be put in the kitchen that's already got them. If you come to me, like I've had clients do recently, hey, Kev, we did a sewer scope and the line's completely broken up out to the street, that's a health and safety concern.
That's different.
Radon is another one, right? Radon comes back positive, not only Are you going to have to deal with that as a seller down the road once you've been notified that it's positive? Those are the things that I think are appropriate for an as-is inspection request. But what I'm seeing it is much like appraisal waivers were being, in my opinion, abused really during COVID, where it was kind of a tip-in and, oh yeah, you should take ours because we'll waive the appraisal. And then when the rubber meets the road, people are standing there like, what do you mean I got to bring $100,000 to closing? Well,
now do you see, so when you say it's a tactic, obviously you're talking about multiple offer
Correct,
scenarios.
correct.
What is it more that it just is a tactic, or does it stem from misunderstanding or a complete lack of understanding in that verbiage for as is? Is it?
I think it's one and two, Scott. I think it is a tactic, and I've seen it happen too many times for it to be misunderstanding. I think it's being abused intentionally, and I do think there's a misunderstanding because they tend to be the younger first-time home buyers that are signing off, and they're not the people that should be signing as is. If you're buying, again, this is all my opinion just based on what we see in the marketplace. If you and I are on our fourth, fifth, and sixth house, we understand what all is involved with owning a home and the expenses. As a first-time buyer, you're going to get that report, especially, and this is a subject for another episode, the way they're written now, they're
Seems like it's
they're almost
crumble
inflammatory. Like, oh my God, you shouldn't buy this house. Well,
it's going to crumble tomorrow.
Correct. There's things that are always going to come up, and I just don't think sometimes when you're a first-time home buyer that you should do the as-is, because sometimes you're going to have to swallow hard and either have somebody explain to you after the contract's been terminated, you just lost that house that you said was your dream house because you asked for a bunch of repairs and the seller said kill the deal. And
if they're using it as a tactic, at least you have to have the understanding or going into it that, hey, this is a tactic and not a lack of
and understand that often the difference between Lisa's offer and Scott's offer is the as is. And by the way, in certain communities, we've got 4, 5, and 6 contracts deep. So you come in with out of bounds inspection related requests, we're moving on because we've got other opportunities.
Sure.
So it's one of those things, be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. And I always caution my buyers, we can do this, but understand you're at risk. And I do think, I don't think it's right because I do it, because I have a wife and 2 daughters that tell me I'm wrong 3 times before I leave the house most days. There's an artful way to handle it. And in the example I use with the sewer line, I'll use the magic paragraph 36 language that says the buyers have conducted an inspection and they find the home in unacceptable condition.
Okay.
Now, if you read the rest of that magic language in paragraph 36, it says, and the contract is hereby terminated. I leave off the and is hereby terminated. I substitute, counsel, I'm going to give you a call to discuss this. Now, some sellers, will tell their attorneys, no, we really mean as is. And those attorneys will respond and say, no need, we understand, we'll kill the deal, which I appreciate. More often than not, I'll pick up the phone, Scott, we did the inspection, sewer line's broken all the way down to the street, it's a $5,000 repair. What does your seller want to do?
Yeah.
That circumstance happened to be an estate sale. Oftentimes we see as is with estate sales because the heirs or the executors don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
So it worked. And that one came together. And again, it's not an example of being right, but I think there's a way to handle the legitimate health and safety concerns instead of just vomiting all of this stuff into the attorney review letter and expecting that the other side's going to be happy about it.
Now, you also mentioned the appraisal waiver. So is this kind of getting into that same territory of because there's ramifications for that same thing, which could
I have a sale next week where there was an appraisal waiver. It was a bad appraisal. There's no getting around it. The comps, every comp to this house was at least $25,000 to $40,000 higher than what this appraised out as.
Wow.
Which is why the buyers, I'm on the sell side, which is why the buyers did the appraisal waiver. We got a bad appraisal. It came in low. Understand that means you're bringing in the difference, right?
Yeah.
Appraisal waivers work great when you're coming in heavy on cash and using loans. So if you're coming in 50% down, appraisal waiver is really not going to be an issue because the lender's not worried about value, right? Their loan isn't the full value of the property. If you're doing like a lot of deals are now, 5%, 3% down, right? With some of the new loan programs, you may be coming in with a fair amount of cash.
So that's just the ramifications. Do you think it's, again, is that more of a tactic that people are using as opposed
absolutely.
to get through
I
multiple
think,
scenarios and, hey, we lost 10 properties, I'm done with that. I want to be on the books with this one and figure it out.
Yes,
Okay.
and again, I tend to work with referral sources in and around the office area. It's not uncommon to hear, again, Naperville, Oak Brook, Burr Ridge, these sorts of places, Downers Grove, Darien. House goes live, if it even gets to MLS.
Yeah.
So today's Thursday when we're doing this. It'll go live today at 5 o'clock. By 5 o'clock tomorrow, Friday, are my days off? Yeah, I'm correct. It's going to flip to last, best, and final because you've got the weekend booked for showings and everything else.
Yeah.
And the appraisal waiver is a way to sort of let the cream rise to the top. The problem we're seeing, again, and this really comes out of COVID as well, we are getting wild appraisal waivers, like $50, $60, $100,000 over.
Jeez.
Now, obviously, there's a certain clientele that can afford to do that, but they're becoming more and more common because the first-time home buyers who got shut out of the market post-COVID, right, they really want to stop living in mom and dad's basement. I say that tongue-in-cheek. They're getting iced out of a lot of deals. There's also a huge influx right now of all cash deals. I bet we're up about 40%, give or take, in the marketplace. And the appraisal's irrelevant on a cash deal, right?
Sure.
So these want to be buying first-time buyers. It's the psychological effect. We've been doing this for 2, 3, 4 months. We're getting kicked in the butt every weekend. We're losing out.
Yeah.
So you want to come in aggressive, and you don't come in under list. You're coming in not only over list, but with an appraisal waiver because you want to get your offer up to the top. The problem is there are people in the marketplace that have more readily available funds, and you come in and you think you're comfortable, come in at the ask price or maybe even $25,000 over, and you say we'll do a $50,000 appraisal waiver. Somebody else comes in and says we'll do $100,000.
Yeah.
I mean, you're limited. There's only so much that you're going to be able to do financially.
But
I do think it's a tactic to try and get your offer accepted. And think about it from the seller's side, right? Especially where you get into the upper crust homes, they're dodgy sometimes in how they're going to appraise out. And I say this, I read an article many years ago in Cranes, well before COVID, and it talked about how luxury properties were stagnating. The economy was strong, but in places like Hinsdale and Lake Bluff was another one, the time on the market was really long. And it's if you stop and think about it, it makes sense, right? If you have the wherewithal to custom build, right, why are you going to buy, and I use this example because it's absolutely true, I don't know that I want a bowling alley in my basement in my Hinsdale home. Yeah. So if you're listing your home at 3 because it's a nice home, and by the way, it's got a bowling alley, I might just go buy a lot and do new construction because I can afford that.
Yeah.
So sometimes these, what I refer to as luxury properties, they're very customized.
Yeah.
And it's just easier in that income strata to say, hey, that's awesome that, every room in your house is a different cosmic color, but I'm just going to move on and do something else. So, that's always a problem in the marketplace. You want to try and, there's a reason
it's different
why.
because you have, instead of having the white elephant on the block, you have all the white elephants in a row, and it's like, well, which one do I want? And
correct.
If you get into that tax bracket, hey, I'll just go build it.
That's exactly it. And that's often the discussion we hear once you get in. It's in my experiences, especially now with values increasing and other things, about $2 million and up. There's a ton of homes available in Oak Brook, Burr Ridge, Hinsdale in that price point. But there's also a lot of open land where you can buy a lot, and the lots are expensive. There's no getting around it. But the reality is, if you've got the ability, why not just do complete custom?
Yeah.
Again, for another time, we can talk about why you want to build custom versus ready, but there's all kinds of different reasons.
Sure. Now, you talked a lot about doing estate sales and being the executor. Are there certain kind of, I don't want to say pitfalls, but are there certain things we got to look out for?
Yeah, there are little things. Good question to ask is if you see on a list, if the seller is listed as the estate of, right, you want to make sure that the person signing the contract isn't the decedent, because we know we're going to have a problem, right? Already. And we want to make sure if Scott's signing on behalf of the estate of, one of the first things we'll ask if we're on the buy side is, do you have what are referred to as letters of office? That means there's been an estate opened,
Okay.
or there are ways around that with bond in lieu of probate. I don't really want to get into that stuff. It's just when we see an estate sale come in, generally some things to be aware of. Who's got the authority to sell it, right? If it's a full probate circumstance, it's easy because somebody's going to have that piece of paper that says I'm the executor or the administrator. Oftentimes, you'll have more flexibility, but that's where you really need to work with your referral partner to figure out how is this property priced versus others, because in my experience, oftentimes, and I'm talking from the probate side of the practice, the heirs, and I point this out in my estate planning meetings all the time, mom and dad think the kids want the house. And I have to break their heart and say, Mom and Dad, the kids don't want the house. They want the value of the house.
Yeah.
So when they get the opportunity, they want to sell it as fast as they can. So you see deals. We've got a Grand Haven deal right now. Ditech's another one. This character, I love his ads on the WGN News. Sell to Joe, or Joe buys your house, or Jeff buys your house, or something. There's a market niche for that, right?
Yeah.
Grandview comes in, and I will credit them because we've worked on a number of deals with them in the office. They truly say as is, and they mean it. So you don't feel like cleaning all of Grandma and Grandpa's stuff out of the house.
Yeah.
You're going to take a hit, right, on a market pricing. We can argue whether that's 20, 25, 30%. But again, if
You're
I'm
not
a
gonna
third
do that.
cousin twice removed and I just happen to be the executor of the estate, I'm not doing all the legwork because this is all found money. So whether I get $100,000 or $120,000
not a
is
difference.
sort of irrelevant. I mean, I'm a guy
Yeah,
who thinks
yeah.
$20 is still real money, but that's a whole separate story. So we often see that kind of with estate sales, just the whole kit and caboodle. You buy it, and it's obviously a good business model. Grand Haven has been doing it for quite a while, and they're a pleasure to work with. I mean, I will give them credit.
And obviously the sellers for those types of transactions where you're dealing with the executor of the estate, those things that you brought up earlier, like as is and all these other things, might be easier maybe to deal with because, again, your example of the 20 grand maybe is not as big a deal when you're not really emotionally tied to that property.
Absolutely, and it gives the parties flexibility in the sense that, look, we're not dealing with this. We understand Mom lived here for 40 years and the attic's full to the rafters. We're not dealing with it. That's why you need to work with your referral partner and make sure, hey, I'll use Caroline, for example. I do a fair number of deals there. It's a 55 and older community, and often Mom or Dad will pass away. The kids want to sell the house. If the comparables are at 350, but your house is a hoarder's haven and packed, and you price at 275 as is, I can tell you, you're on the buy side, don't play games. There's a reason why they placed that number on it. They're serious. You're buying all the crap that's in the house with it because they don't want to deal with it. So don't think you're going to come in lower
Lowball them another 50
because
grand.
they're at their limit. They know
Yeah,
what they want. So I think it's good to know your referral partner and make sure that they are well aware of what's out there, and that's always a good piece of advice. I'm often the one, ironically, that has to explain to the seller, well, should you or shouldn't you? I don't like to spend my seller's money any more than they do. I just try and present them with options. Hey, I talked to the listing agents. There's 5 other houses in a 2-block radius, same price points. Your house is wonderful, and I understand that, and I know you think it's worth $1 million, except your kitchen hasn't been updated in 30 years, and your bathrooms are still, fuchsia and mauve and these colors. You might want to consider some concessions because that one house that's priced only $50,000 more 2 blocks away has a 5-year-old kitchen and has been completely redone. The first floor master suite. If people start looking around, you may lose your deal, and that's. My goal is never to push clients one way or the other. We just try and give them options, obviously on both sides of the deal. Here's all the information we have. You have to make a decision because you're the person that's going to be driving past Home Depot and throwing $100 out the window for the next 30 years every year, every week rather. So you have to be comfortable with it.
So you talked about inspection, possible issues or tactics. We've talked about appraisals. What about surveys? That would be kind of the only other thing up front for sellers that maybe.
We get the request often. I have 2, and part of the reason, as you can imagine, that's on your list of questions. One is a 40-plus-year-old survey from when the house was built. No competent lawyer is taking a survey that's that old. Too much, even if you sign the affidavit of no new improvement, too much has changed. We may now have easements all the way around the house, other things. It's dodgy. What typically it comes down to is is the lender going to wade in and accept an older survey?
Yep.
The second example I have, it just happened this morning. I have a survey, nothing's been changed. It's from October of 2019. Buyer's attorney's comfortable with it. There'll be an affidavit of no new improvement. So, the title company's comfortable with it. So that's when it works. Coming to me and asking if the buyer is going to accept the survey from 1985 when you bought the house, it's a dodgy proposition, right? And I tell you that because on the flip side, I generally am hesitant after about 10 years because now we don't know what the municipality has done by way of easements and other things, and those may not be showing up on older surveys.
Yep. So one of the things, now you've talked about kind of getting into a deal, getting a deal processed. Is there any kind of post-closing along the same line of thought?
Everything seems to be post-closing anymore. There seems to be a real uptick in post-closing issues. Look, the reality is there's the concept that I learned many years ago from a colleague of mine, merger with a deed. For most things, you buy the house and you own it as is. The obvious exceptions are, did you represent that the house was appropriately taxed, and you sheepishly say, oh no, we redid everything and never pulled permits. Well, part of the reason you pull permits, aside from generating revenue, is it increases your tax liability, right? It affects your assessment. And the infamous one, as we've had almost 2 inches of rain in the past 14 days, a week after closing, I get water in the basement.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what do we know, right? Well, if you had water in the basement 30 years ago and you had it fixed and you didn't disclose, me personally, I think you're going to have a problem. Okay. Because you're aware that there was water. I err on the side because it's easier to deal with this on the front end, pre-closing, than on the back side. I tend to tell clients over disclose, right?
Sure.
If you've been in the house for 20 years and when you first moved in, you got seepage a couple of times, tell them we got seepage a couple of times, but we put in a backup sump pump. We've never had issues since. Or we did this or that, or whatever the case is. It's just so much easier when we're still in attorney review, when we're on the front end of it, because people then know what they're getting. There's nothing worse than thinking everything's great in the house, you close, and this is a real story. I mean, every attorney's got the post-closing stories, but this one I remember is a very nice home in Naperville. Post-closing, poured buckets. We closed on a Thursday or a Friday, pours like for 2 days straight. Saturday, new homeowners are now pulling up the soaked carpet in the basement. They see all the patches from where there's been Permaseal or U.S. waterproof, whatever the case may be.
Somebody
so obvious
work, not disclosed.
And those are actually easy, Scott, to deal with because on the sell side, all I do is pick up the phone and call a client and say, yeah, Scott called and said they can see 18 different patch areas in the basement where obvious work has been done, and you said you never got seepage. I think we're going to need to talk about settling this.
Yeah.
Or same song, different lyrics, I should say. Buyer's attorney calls and says, hey, Kev, we got water in the basement. And the neighbors on each side say, oh, yeah, Joe had U.S. waterproofing out twice last year, never did anything with it.
Yeah.
Or my favorite, and this did happen to me, one of my buyer clients, move in, water in the basement, called Permaseal, and oh, hey, Mr. Camden, who was the prior homeowner, good to hear from you again. You want to act on that estimate we gave you 5 years ago to fix the leaks in the foundation?
Yeah.
That's very easy for me to make that call or talk to the other side. Hey, we have evidence, dead bang, that you lied, right? So water is the one, because water is, as any home inspector will tell you, any contractor, water is a beast, and it doesn't happen all the time, right? There's nothing consistent with water. And let's be honest, whether you believe in global warming or not, and I'm not trying to kick that hornet's nest, we get a lot more rain in a lot shorter period of time than we have historically.
Yeah.
And I think you would agree with me that we have 100-year rains seemingly every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And somebody legitimately may never have had water and then you go for a period of time where you get 4, 5, 6 inches of rain in 3 weeks, pun intended, the dam's going to break. And sometimes stuff where we never had issues develops issues.
So people that want to, I mean, obviously the last couple examples you've given are litigation and obviously being on the closing side, the aspect of this. People that want to litigate, what do you tell them? Like, do you have a little spiel for them? Like,
so my office,
do it, or
my office policy is our engagement stops at the closing, and we make it clear in our engagement letter. We will make, if we have a post-closing issue, we'll make one phone call, send one letter on your behalf. The problem is they tend to
spill
to
over,
grow tentacles, and suddenly, the for the flat fee, I'm dealing with all kinds of post-closing. And the reality is, it's a separate engagement. Sometimes, in the examples that I gave, it's very easy. When Permit Seal says, "Yeah, here's a 5-year-old estimate for the work that we're going to do to fix the leak in the basement," I've been on the receiving side of those phone calls, and I just tell the sellers, settle this out. There's always the exposure of attorney fees under the contract, but then you've got theories of fraud and other things. And the reality is, when you look at who's going to court, it's not surprising that aside from family law, that ironic euphemism, there aren't a lot of individuals suing each other in court. Litigation's expensive.
Yes.
So, my rule of thumb is, if you really want to litigate, I don't do it, but most of the attorneys I refer to will say they want 10 grand up in front, and that's not Cook County. That's our area here, DuPage in particular. So it's not cheap, and that's also a barometer, right? If you think it's going to cost $3,500 to remediate the water issue in the basement, the foundation cracks, litigation is unpredictable. If it wasn't, it would be a science. It tends to be more of an art. It's not fast. Right? Yeah. Sometimes, and I have one particular client in mind, once you start to talk about the length of the process, the cost, and by the way, even if you get your costs, no attorney, let's assume it goes to judgment and you get your fees awarded, ain't no attorney working for free to get to that point with the expectation they'll get paid later. So you're paying whoever's litigating, and sometimes it's just easier to take your lumps and say, you know what, for the couple grand, let's just deal with it. We're frustrated, but let's just move on.
You're going to spend $5,000 to make 3
or more. Yeah.
So one of the other things we were talking about that's kind of a hot button lately is the NAR settlement. Yeah. So I know one of the things that's coming up, one of the possible changes coming up here is a buyer's agreement. So
I don't think it's possible. I mean, from what I've dug in on this, it's going to be required. If not, I can't remember if it was July 1st or August 1st, but let's be real clear. By September 1st, they will be in place, and you're going to start seeing them on a regular basis. I'm a proponent of them for a couple of reasons. Again, on the probate and estate side, you want to make sure that you're protected as a buyer's agent. If for some reason you get entrenched in litigation in a probate estate and the court says, no, you don't have to pay the listing agent their commission, well, the way it works now is I call Scott. Scott says, I'll split 4% with you. Well, if Scott gets 0%, am I getting 0%? So it protects the agent there. But what I think is probably even more important is it allows, and I think the good agents, the folks that really get it, it allows them to outline their services, explain why it's valuable, explain why the buyer may have to pay it. Now, that may be a deal killer. I understand, a 2% commission on a $600,000-$700,000 house is real money. I get it. I also think there are going to be seller concessions as a way to deal with some of that.
Okay.
And I also think, and we'll have this recorded so we can check, I think between 6 and 9 months down the road, the market will have leveled out where I read these articles, and they tend to come out of places like California. Real estate agents are going to be dead, and there's going to be no more commission. Well, first of all, if that were the case, why hasn't it worked out that way on the commercial side?
Sure.
Why didn't Redfin topple the MLS? Why didn't Purple Door do that in England? What did Redfin ultimately do? They just got in bed with MLS, and they said, fine, we'll give you a bunch of money. Let's work this thing out. It's a tough nut to crack. I also think there's a practical reality of it, and I use the example of like dealing with a pro se defendant when you're an attorney. It's very difficult because the court goes out of its way to give them benefit of the doubt, give them all kinds of extra things that an attorney wouldn't get. If I'm a listing agent and I have the opportunity to work with Joe, who doesn't have an agent, as a buyer, which
Yep.
means I'm going to do listing agent work plus buyer's agent work.
More work.
I'm probably going to reach into my pocket and say, you know what, I'd rather work with Tom because Tom's got an agent and it makes my life easier. The irony to that example is for the people that really need the relief with the commissions, they're not going to see it. I have been told unequivocally by more than 3 referral sources, it is standard 6% at 100,000 or under. Now stop and think about that for a second. The people that need the most relief on a relative basis are at the lower price point.
Sure.
The reality is, I don't see 6% commissions except in that lower price point.
Yeah.
If I'm selling a Downers Grove property, an Oak Brook, a Tinley, nobody's seeing 6. So the fallacy that 6% is standard, at least in the greater Chicago area, it's not there, number one. Number two, the people that have been selling in, it's on 31st Street, the exclusive subdivision in Oak Brook, they're sitting on a $4 or $5 million home. They know they've got negotiating power, so they were never paying 6.
Yeah.
Right? If a listing agent comes in and says, I want 6, that's nice, see you later, because there'll be 3 that come in behind him that say, we'll do it for 4 or maybe even 3, Midwest Club. So that's not going to help anybody in that regard. Where I see the problem is the people that needed the relief, to the extent there needed to be relief, and I think that's a fair question, at the lower purchase or lower sales point, this is also going to create an underground and some nefarious element where, and this also is probably maybe point number 3 why I think we need buyer's agreements. You're taking your client around, Scott, and you've agreed you're going to get 2%.
Yep.
And scurrilous Sandy comes over and says, hey, I'll put the offer in the house and I'll take 0.5%. And I'm going to save you $8,000. If you don't have a buyer's agreement, what are you going to do? You're going to file a complaint, you're going to go through all of that, but the long and short is you ain't getting paid. Right. Let's put a fine point on it. The other thing that's going to happen is, and multiple agencies that I work, brokerages that I work with have said this, all we're going to do is hire more staff, because now that the settlement says we can't put the commission split on MLS, you know what's going to happen? I'm your agent, Scott, and we go look at a house in Midwest Club. Are we just going to blindly assume that we're going to get seller concessions or commissions? No. We could have looked at the MLS pre-settlement. So now you know what's going to happen? I'm just going to pick up the phone and call the listing agent. So what was supposed to be put out into the sunlight, I don't think is going to have short term. I think it's going to be rocky for 6 months or so because there's going to be kind of this unease. But ultimately, I think it will become the new normal. Everybody will settle out. And, you know, we hear irrational comments from people that don't understand residential real estate in Washington, like title insurance is unnecessary. I mean, let's talk about that for another day. You know, this is another example of the law of unintended consequences. All I think the settlement is going to do is reinforce why people want agents. Now, again, I'll go back to my Downers Grove example. Seller lists the house today at 5 o'clock. By 5 o'clock tomorrow, there's 30 offers. Yep. Do you think the unrepresented people have a shot? No, because they're going to do what? You might do an as-is based on your agent's advice. You might do an appraisal waiver. You might come in over offer, right? And the example I say is, you know what? You want to buy in Downers Grove without an agent, knock yourself out. There's signs all around Downers Grove. And I'm sure when you call, they'll say, sure, come on over Saturday or Sunday. And my suspicion is you're going to get a call late Friday or early Saturday morning saying, yeah, Scott, we've already accepted another offer.
Yeah.
And I think conceptually people think it's easy. It's not. And I also think, and this is not anything my office was looking for, but we have to adjust our fees when it's for sale by owner, because we do wind up doing what the agents do. I don't want to do agent work. If I did, I would go get my license and not practice law. But what sellers don't understand is I'm not doing a flat fee transaction at $500 or $600 for you to say $15,000 in commission. You're going to pay the attorneys more, at least in our office, and I'm seeing it with other attorneys' offices as well with for sale by owner. We had several come in this week. Just the time of walking through the contract and filling the information out and everything else ties up one of my paralegals for anywhere from an hour to 2 hours.
Yeah.
Right? You can't do that at the $500 or $600 flat, even at the $700 flat fee rate. So short-term confusion,
might create more work for the attorney.
It's gonna in the short term, which
yeah.
I don't think any of us really wanted, because it's not the kind of work that we're looking for. It makes, for all the reasons that a listing agent wants a buyer's agent, I want a listing agent on the contract, so it complicates that. And it's gonna open the door for untoward sort of stuff. It's ultimately gonna level out. And again, this will be memorialized. I don't think the commissions are gonna drop substantially over time, and I don't see the agents going away.
So you don't think, with all this, that it's going to have long term, not immediately, nobody knows the near future, but long term, it's not going to affect commissions as a whole from kind of where they're at now. We'll go down a little bit, maybe, but
I don't see it, because again, the premise of if you understood the lawsuit, it was based on a 6% commission. And if you really want to get into the nuance of the lawsuit, the named plaintiff, it was a class action, the named plaintiff said something to the effect of, because of the commissions, I lost half the equity in my house. Now stop and think for a second. You either recently bought, or you've got a heck of a high home equity loan that you got to pay down or something. But just use round numbers, right? Let's say you have a $300,000 home. Even at 6%, I'm not really good with math, but 3 by 6, it's $18,000. On a $300,000 home, you had $36,000 in equity, that's it? Which means you were heavily mortgaged, right?
Oh, yeah, you leveraged
so
to the hill.
People are worked up about, the commissions are a ripoff. Well, they can be, but the facts, I think, were so limited in that case that it turned into something that I don't really think it's going to be in a lot of places. I think the reality is, especially now, right? I'll talk about our current market, with a lot of older homeowners that are rolling out of houses in Illinois for other places. Again, another great topic. People that have a lot of equity in places, people that want to downsize, and because COVID is the gift that keeps on giving, but in a good way, people are realizing I'm not going to have to go back to the office anytime soon. So while it's fun, I got to get a true home office. I can't sit in my kid's nursery every day and work. So we're going to start seeing more movement as a result of those things. My crystal ball's broke, because I thought we would have had 2 rate cuts by this point in the year, so I'm not playing that game anymore. But I think there's going to be still a lot of market movement, and the reality is the agents play a vital role. In my opinion, I'm not blowing smoke. They have a job, and they do it very well. And this is why I think buyer's agents should use the opportunity to get that form signed, to explain what they do and what the value is. It's a sales opportunity for them. I'm not interested, and this is when I get pushed back on why we are going to have a higher fee. I just lay it on the table. Well, how come your fee is going to be that? I said, Scott, I'm not interested in scheduling your appraisal, scheduling the inspection, picking up radon, all of these things that agents do and are paid for. Somebody's going to have to do it. And the reality is, you're not. That's why I say I don't think the lawyers, by and large, short term we will, because there are going to be people that want to try it. But longer term, again, I don't think we really want to be, at least my office doesn't really want to be involved in that, because it just complicates the process.
It seems like, from talking to 2 different groups, brokers and attorneys, it seems like attorneys, it's a good thing that the buyer's having the discussion with the buyer's agent. Because if you're talking about what I'm going to get paid or what I'm going to pay you, if you're the consumer, I think that's kind of where that whole thing was supposed to be going, is how could that be a bad thing? Is that a fair...
I think, as often is the case, I said there were 2 things that I thought that Washington has made foolish statements about. One is that title insurance is unnecessary. 2 is, well, we'll just rewrite, FHA, VA. Well, sure, it'll happen, on the head of a pin that fast.
Right.
The reality is, in VA transactions, you cannot pay a buyer's commission. Yeah. FHA you can, but the reality is nobody does. So to take this broad approach of, well, we'll just change how loans are done. No, you really won't. And when you start looking at the novel programs that lenders are coming up with by way of down payment assistance, I've heard 40-year mortgages, and I'm not just hearing of one. It's not a one-off, right? I mean, this is becoming a thing. So when you look at the true economics of it, buyers don't have the additional cash to pay the commission. So,
well, the reason you have a 3% down program is for people that don't have 10,
absolutely.
15, 20%.
So all we're going to see is form over substance. So instead of 2 commission listings on the seller side of the settlement statement, you'll see one, but then surprisingly you're going to see something that says either seller concessions or credits or whatever, and they're going to be bigger numbers than we've seen before. But if you do the math, you're going to say, wait a minute, that looks like a 2% and a 2% commission.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But that's...
But if you have that agreement, you can then ship it off to the lender and say, hey, listen, as the agent, here's how I'm going to get paid through this, so they don't use those.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But again, law of unintended consequences. And it's fundamental, just like when CFPB was created and TRID and all of that stuff, and Washington thought it was going to be the silver bullet and make the process easier. All it's done is confuse people. I still argue, I have a client I argue with, but we had a discussion, well, why do I have to have title insurance? It says optional. I said, well, first of all, it's not optional. Well, why does it say that? I said, because some Poindexter in Washington didn't realize that half the states in this country still have attorneys at the table. And by the way, they never bothered to ask lenders, is title insurance optional? It's never optional when you have a loan. So if you don't believe me, talk to your lender. And actually, just as an aside, right after TRID and CFPB came into being, I did have a client argue with me, a buyer client. We're not going to buy it. We're not going to buy it. I said, okay, talk to your lender. Lender's like, we're not giving you a loan without title insurance.
Yeah.
Oh. So I just think there's a lot of misguided good intentions from Washington because the policymakers don't really understand the brass tacks of how things are going. It's not that daily agents aren't doing anything and just getting a 6% skim and splitting it.
Speaking of government agencies, Fannie and Freddie, I know one of the things you're talking about was condos. I mean, is there a lot of changes going on there?
Well, there are significant changes, and it came as a result. I don't remember the building name or the complex name, but that the condo tower collapse in Florida. Over the last couple of years, Freddie and Fannie have increased their underwriting requirements for multi-unit buildings. And ironically, it was the same buyer lost 2 contracts recently. One building he went to, the municipality having jurisdiction actually condemned the balconies. The association was aware of it, had a structural engineer's report that said these need to be fixed, and weren't doing anything with it. Lenders like, we can't get this approved. You're not going to get conventionally approved.
Sure.
Rather, I've talked with several attorneys that do much more work in the city, and it is much more common now that listings are saying non-conventional only, because what's happening as a result of Florida, there's a requirement at Freddie and Fannie that there are these structural reports that have to be done. Well, if you're not doing them, that's a problem for Freddie and Fannie.
Sure.
If you're doing them, like other associations are starting to do, you're opening the door for, okay, this is great. Every balcony in a 70-unit complex has to be replaced. That's going to be about a $3 million special assessment.
Yeah.
Once it's committed to paper, there has to be a process that indicates it's being dealt with. And I also think, again, right, when I talk about law of unintended consequences, I also think there's going to be more than a few. These are going to be smaller buildings, probably member managed, that just aren't going to do this kind of stuff. So again, the whole reason of, we want to make sure that, this 300-unit condo tower that was built on sand right next to the ocean doesn't fall down. Now we're going to have associations not wanting to deal with concerns about deferred maintenance and other things for fear that they're going to be immovable. In other words, not resaleable.
Yeah, they're going to be ostracized. No one's going to look at the building because it won't.
I don't know if this is true or not, and I'm just taking it. The source is reliable. A friend of mine's brother moved down to Florida, got whacked with like a $60,000 special for some pretty big projects. It's a big complex. 6 months later, got a $200,000 special as a result of these structural requirements. They have to reinforce the concrete piers.
Boy.
So now what happens, right? Again, I understand why we're doing it, and I get it, but now you've completely taken an entire complex of X hundred units and made them saleable only at a discount and only with non-conventional financing. And the reality is, I think it's going to drive a lot of stuff underground.
So with all these changes, everything we've been talking about, like, what's your kind of outlook for this market going forward the next couple of years? Is it just stuff we'll deal with it like we have with TRID and CFPB and GFE laws that we'll just adapt to it? Is it?
So the one headwind that we haven't talked about, and I don't want to get too into the weeds, IDFPR got waylaid with COVID. They had their staff doing a ton of COVID-related stuff. they're going to be looking to change the disclosure form again. Any lawyer that's been around for more than 15 minutes, anybody in the title industry knows that's coming around. There's questions about reforming the Title Act in Illinois, this, that, and the other thing. That's a headwind for the lawyers, I think, to be concerned about, and to a degree, rightly so. But what do I see more broadly? We know this historically. The Midwest, and this area in particular, tends to decline slower than other areas. It tends to climb out slower than other areas. Our year-over-year home values are increasing. The value of the average home nationwide is increased year over year. Nobody's going to dispute that rates in the 7s, and for the brief time that they were in the 8s, slowed down the market. We're still suffering those effects, right? It has put a cap on the ability to move. But again, if you're of a certain age, 52, you realize that 25 years ago, double-digit mortgages were not uncommon.
Yeah.
And yeah, 7's not as good as 3, but that was never real, and it was never going to be long-term, right? And I think coupled with the realities of maybe lifestyle changes, wanting to get out of the state, maybe lifestyle changes, I don't really have to commute to the Loop as often, so maybe Winnebago County is much more appealing now because I can buy twice the house for a third of the price and
No
get
taxes.
land, whatever the case is. I think that's going to continue to happen. The oddball is the inflation that nobody seems to be able to get their arms around, and we'll see. I mean, obviously it's an election year, and we'll see where it goes. I think we're going to be in kind of a same market where we have been. I heard some things from a couple of the big number aggregators on a podcast. They think we may be hitting the bottom with respect to inventory. Some of the big home builders, particularly in California, Pulte, D.R. Horton, they have been crushing it with loan buy downs. I saw a figure like first quarter, Pulte, 83% of their new construction went to Pulte Mortgage because they could offer the lower rate. And builders are making profit hand over fist right now because they're able to do that where your average home buyer cannot. That raises a good point too, though. We talked about seller concessions with respect to commissions. In COVID or pre-COVID, when markets were crazy and other things, rate buy downs were always out there for sellers, right? And that's an opportunity as well. Again, I think you need to work with a good referral team. Not every lender is going to be aware that you could do a rate buy down. There's going to have to be some seasoning. I mean, some lenders are going to have to. The lender will have to work through some really crappy markets to realize there are things that are legal and attractive that you can do to be able to sell your home, particularly if you've got a lot of equity in it. So long term, I think we're going to see a lot of what we've been seeing, which is to say marginal increases month over month, year over year. The interesting phenomenon to me is even though we tend to be busier over the summer months, the last 4 or 5 years, and I understand part of that is COVID, there really isn't a quote-unquote traditional season. We've seen as
like
many...
a big slowdown and then a pickup. It's just kind of
10
more
years
level.
ago, between Thanksgiving and Memorial Day, if you sold 3 or 4 houses, that was a lot. The last several years, we've had multiple deals in the month of December, which used to be, no pun intended, just as cold as ice. January, same thing. The reality is, I don't think there's a traditional sense anymore of what the market's going to be. I think we see more in May, June, July, August, September. But the reality is there's still a lot going around year-round. So at the same time, maybe the growth has slowed. It's expanded and maybe pushed the sales out across 10 or 11 months instead of just that, condensed May, June, July, August window. So that's what I'm seeing, or what I'm thinking anyway.
Well, obviously you've put a lot of thought into this, done a lot of research. Folks that are looking to work with you, what is the easiest way to get a hold of you?
I learned this on WGN. You repeat your phone number often. Just call the office, 630-568-6656, 630-568-6656, or just catch us on the web, camdenlawoffice.com. We're responsive. Like most real estate attorneys, email's easier to respond to than phone calls sometimes, but we try and be very attentive to both. But we have a strong web presence, and we're proud of it. So drop us a line either way. We're happy to help.
And I think most people prefer that type of communication nowadays, the electronic.
Look, the reality is it's just more effective. There's no getting around it, right? Yeah, it's nice to talk to other people. I understand that, but it's just easier.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming by today. We
My
definitely
pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks.